"How dare you propose to someone else?" The words echoed through the restaurant. Margaret stood frozen. David stood frozen. And the woman remained exactly where she was, staring directly at him. For a few seconds, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The entire room seemed to be waiting for David to explain what was happening. But he didn't. His silence only made the moment more frightening. Margaret looked from David to the woman and back again. Her heart was racing. Questions flooded her mind. Who was she? How did she know David? And why did he suddenly look like a man whose entire world was falling apart? The woman's eyes filled with emotion. She pointed at David once more. "Tell her who I am." Again, David said nothing. Not a single word. And in that silence, Margaret realized something she never thought possible. The man she had just agreed to marry was hiding something. Something serious. Something powerful enough to turn one of the happiest moments of her life into a nightmare. What Margaret didn't know was that the answer to the woman's question would change everything. But first, a far bigger truth was about to come to light. The woman took a deep breath. Tears filled her eyes as she looked directly at Margaret. Then she said the words that seemed to drain all the air from the room. "I'm his wife." Silence. The restaurant became so quiet that nobody dared move. Margaret felt her stomach drop. For a moment, she was convinced she had misheard her. His wife? That wasn't possible. Just minutes earlier, she had accepted David's proposal. Just minutes earlier, she had imagined a future with him. Now everything was collapsing. Slowly, Margaret turned toward David. This was his chance to explain. His chance to deny it. His chance to tell her there had been some terrible misunderstanding. But David said nothing. He couldn't even meet her eyes. The silence felt like an answer. Margaret's heart broke a little more with every passing second. And as David stood there unable to speak, one terrible thought began spreading through her mind. What if every warning sign had been trying to tell her the truth all along? Finally, David spoke. His voice was barely above a whisper. "She's telling the truth." Margaret felt her heart sink. The restaurant remained silent. David took a deep breath and looked directly at Margaret. "She is legally my wife." The words hit harder than anything she had imagined. But before Margaret could respond, David continued. "There is something you don't know." For the first time since entering the restaurant, the woman remained silent. David explained that they had separated years ago. They had not lived together in a very long time. Their marriage had effectively ended. But there was one problem. The divorce had never been finalized. Margaret stared at him in disbelief. Why? If they had been separated for years, why had they never completed the process? David lowered his head. "It wasn't because we still loved each other." His voice cracked. "It was because of what happened to our family." The emotion on both their faces was impossible to ignore. Suddenly, the situation felt different. The anger, the silence, the unfinished marriage. It all seemed connected to something much deeper. And for the first time since the woman arrived, Margaret wasn't sure what to believe. Before David could say another word, the woman began to cry. The anger that had carried her into the restaurant seemed to disappear. Now she looked heartbroken. Margaret didn't understand. Just moments ago, she had been certain this woman had come to expose David. Now she seemed overwhelmed by something else entirely. Something far more painful. Margaret looked from the woman to David and back again. Nothing about the situation made sense anymore. The restaurant remained silent. Everyone was waiting. Waiting for someone to explain. Waiting for the missing piece. The woman wiped away her tears and slowly turned toward Margaret. When she finally spoke, her voice trembled. "There is something Margaret doesn't know." Margaret felt a chill run through her body. David immediately closed his eyes, as if he already knew what was coming next. And judging by the fear on his face, whatever the woman was about to reveal was far worse than an unfinished marriage. The woman struggled to hold back her tears. Then she finally revealed the truth. Years ago, she and David had a daughter they loved more than anything. But one day, she disappeared. Without warning, without answers, without a trace. Margaret felt her heart sink as the woman spoke. David stood motionless. The pain on his face said more than words ever could. For years, they searched. They followed leads. They spoke to investigators. They refused to give up hope. Every holiday, every birthday, every passing year, they kept believing they might find her. The woman looked at Margaret through tears. The reason we never finalized the divorce wasn't because we wanted to stay married. David lowered his head. It was because we never stopped searching for our daughter. Suddenly, everything changed. The unfinished marriage no longer felt like a hidden romance. It felt like a wound that had never healed. For the first time that night, Margaret wasn't looking at David as a man who had betrayed her. She was looking at a father carrying a heartbreak few people could imagine. And yet, one question still remained. If this was the truth, why had David never told her? Margaret looked at David, her eyes filled with emotion. After everything she had heard, only one question remained. Why didn't you tell me? The restaurant was silent. David's eyes filled with tears. When he finally answered, his voice broke. Because I was afraid you'd leave. Margaret stared at him. For months, he had carried this secret alone. Not because he didn't care. Not because he was hiding another relationship. But because he was terrified of losing the one person who had brought light back into his life. No one spoke. For a long moment, the entire room seemed frozen in place. Then Margaret slowly reached for David's hand. He looked up at her. Hope and fear filled his eyes. It was the moment that would decide everything. But before Margaret could answer, a phone suddenly rang. The sound cut through the silence. Everyone turned. The woman's face went pale. David's eyes widened. Slowly, he looked at the screen. And then he stopped breathing. Displayed on the phone was a name neither of them had seen in years. Their daughter's name. For a moment, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The impossible was staring back at them from the screen. The daughter they had searched for. The daughter they had mourned. The daughter they believed they might never find. Was calling. And as the phone continued to ring, every person in the restaurant stood frozen in shock. Then, only seconds later, the phone rang again. The same name. The same number. This time, David answered. His hand trembled as he lifted the phone to his ear. For a moment, he couldn't speak. Then a voice came through. A voice he had not heard in years. A voice he thought he might never hear again. Tears streamed down his face. The woman collapsed into a chair. Margaret stood frozen. And in that moment, nothing else mattered. Not the secrets. Not the misunderstandings. Not the unfinished marriage. Only one truth remained. The daughter they had spent years searching for was alive. In the weeks that followed, life changed for everyone. The phone call that once seemed impossible became the beginning of a new chapter. David and the woman who had entered the restaurant that night finally received the answers they had spent years searching for. The pain of the past could never be erased, but for the first time in a very long time, hope had returned. And through it all, Margaret remained by David's side. She saw the truth of who he was. Not a perfect man, not a man without mistakes, but a man who had carried heartbreak for years while desperately trying to hold on to hope. One evening, several months later, David asked Margaret to return to the same restaurant where everything had nearly fallen apart. This time there were no secrets, no interruptions, no unanswered questions, only honesty, only family, only love. As they sat together, David reached across the table and took Margaret's hand. "Thank you for staying," he said quietly. Margaret smiled. For years, she had believed her best days were behind her. She had convinced herself that love belonged to another chapter of her life. But she had been wrong. Sometimes life surprises us when we least expect it. Sometimes happiness arrives later than we planned. And sometimes the greatest act of courage is choosing to trust again after you've been hurt. A few months later, surrounded by family, friends, and the people who mattered most, Margaret and David were married. The woman who had once walked into the restaurant in tears was there too, celebrating the healing that had finally come to all of their lives. As Margaret looked around the room, she realized something important. The loneliness that had once filled her evenings was gone. The empty chair across the table was no longer empty, and the future she thought had passed her by was waiting right in front of her. At 57, Margaret had found something she never expected to find again. A second chance. And this time, she embraced it with her whole heart.